Yeah, I'll call you back.
And then I have like 4 questions. We'll ask some follow-ups in between. I think that might take like 25
Yeah, I mean, I think we'll play. Yeah, see, someone will hold out when it's time. We'll signal to you when it's time to kind of so he's going, and look, if it's there's just a lot to talk about and we won't quite get to the questions, like we'll play.
someone kind of flash a card.
You just look for me or for but I'll be here, and I'll come stand. Yeah. So, signal to you. I'll signal you. I may have to step out for just a second at the beginning, but then I'll be back. Hey, good morning, everyone. Welcome back. So good to see everybody. We had a fantastic first day and looking forward to another engaging day of programming, including conversations on artificial intelligence, keys to building affordable housing. We have the latest on federal broadband funding coming to your communities and public safety. We'll wrap up at lunch with an inspiring session on how to bridge differences and bring people together. But first, we want to finish what we started yesterday. We have the conclusion of a series of conversations digging into the freedom agenda released by the New Deal and the New Democrat Coalition. Central, of course, to that agenda is protecting our democracy. We're proud of the role that New Deal secretaries of state are playing to promote voting and run our elections smoothly. And we're thrilled to be joined by New Mexico Secretary of State Maggie Toulouse-Oliver, along with Beth Wong, Program Officer of Civic Engagement and Democracy at TIDES. Beth leads the Healthy Democracy Fund, a pooled fund that seeks to close racial voter turnout gaps and has granted over $17 million to over 100 organizations since 2020. As we welcome them up, we'll have them come up to the stage. I want to also recognize the Secretary as a winner of our Ideas Challenge that we talked about quite a bit yesterday for her leadership on the New Mexico Voting Rights Act and election infrastructure legislation. As you may have noticed, the many great New Deal submissions we received for the challenge really illustrate the kind of policies that support our freedom agenda. You can go to our website to check out all the submissions, which provide a roadmap to lower cost and expand opportunities for families, promote equity, and target underserved communities, make effective use of federal funds, and protect democracy. So before we get started with the panel, I do want to present, we have a video to show featuring our 4 winners, including the Secretary.
This year, for the 6th Biennial Ideas Challenge, over 50 New Deal leaders submitted policy ideas
that address the most pressing issues facing Americans today.
That's 78 proposals that are focused on demonstrating how government can work effectively to solve problems and deliver tangible results.
I'm proud to say that I'm an Ideas Challenge 2023 winner.
And that my idea, creating a diverse STEM workforce by leveraging federal CHIPS funding, is shaping a bright future in Oregon.
The New Mexico Voting Rights Act is shaping the future of New Mexico.
The Georgia Educational Opportunity Act will help shape the future of Georgia.
It is shaping the future of the city of Richmond. And I want to create ladders to opportunity, ladders to success for so many of our children. And the Richmond Pathways program is essentially a traditional promise scholarship on steroids.
It's about time that we caught up with our peers and actually provided a set of resources for every single child to ensure that their economic situation, their zip code does not predetermine their success.
It has been my work in the legislature to talk about closing the gap between talent and opportunity. And that's where it really hits home, because we have brilliant kids across this state that if they didn't have the opportunity, they won't go as far as they could. And I think for our national defense, our national security, for our more leadership in STEM, that is essential.
We're already getting super positive feedback on the notice to all voters. Thank you so much for telling me where, when, and how I can cast my ballot. So even though there are always challenges with implementation, once we kind of get something launched and off the ground and working in real life, that is so rewarding.
New Deal leaders aren't the type of leaders that will take their ball and go home. We're trying to find success, and we recognize that the real victory in all this is by us doing the right thing by those who need us.
We want to make sure that people have the absolute best lives they can possibly have, and that is what government should be doing, investing in its people and delivering results.
Good morning, everyone. So wonderful to see you all this morning. My name is Beth Huang. I'm the program officer at the Tides Foundation, focused on civic engagement and democracy. I'm so excited for this conversation with Secretary Toulouse Oliver today, and I really want to invite everyone to think about what democracy means to you. To me, it goes beyond Election Day, it goes beyond voters, and it goes beyond the ballot box. To me, it's that everyday people have an everyday say in the decisions that impact their lives. And our North Star at the Tides Healthy Democracy Fund is that we have a multiracial democracy in which everyone feels included, everyone feels heard, that if you want to vote, you can vote. If you can vote, you do vote. And then finally, if you do vote, you and your communities are represented in the halls of power every day. And we see so many different types of barriers to that, whether it's the micro-targeted voter suppression laws, whether that shorten the windows for voting by mail, or moving of campus polling locations. These are the things that micro-target people who are already denied power. And we also see this in the constant vicious cycle of low participation, and if your community doesn't participate, your elected officials, whether or not they really mean to do it, pay a little bit less attention to you, which cause your community to feel unheard and underinvested. And this doesn't have to be this way. And so at the Healthy Democracy Fund at the Tides Foundation, we invest in the trusted messengers, the community-based organizations that are curbing that cycle and are increasing voter participation in their communities year after year, week after week. And the Healthy Democracy Fund in the year 2023, a so-called off year, although I'm sure many of you had election days just last week and doesn't feel like an off year to you all. We've granted $17 million this year to community-based organizations and in 11 states that have faced historic voter suppression and also have increasingly diversifying communities. And so I'm so excited to learn more about our Secretary of State from New Mexico. Yes, I think you all can give another set of shout outs. Who has so much expertise in administering elections for the past 16 years.
Almost 17.
Almost 17 years. I can't even imagine how many cycles, special elections, and more.
Therapist bills.
And so I'm excited to learn how first, in your 16, almost 17 years of administering elections, I'm so curious how voting has changed for everyday people and what that's meant for you in your office.
Sure. Well, first of all, good morning. Happy to finally be here at the conference. I was telling Debbie that the New Mexico legislature is way less organized than the New Deal because this conference was planned out way before they told me I had to come to a budget hearing, a pre-session budget hearing with our interim legislative finance committee the other day. So I'm late, but I'm here, better late than never. Thank you all for having me, and I really am happy we get to have this conversation. I think as New Deal leaders, it goes without saying that the future of our democracy, I know, is on all of our minds, and what's going to happen next year is on all of our minds. A lot of things have changed. One thing that's really changed as an election administrator, so I was a local election administrator for 10 years in Bernalillo County, which is the Albuquerque metropolitan area of New Mexico, so the biggest jurisdiction. So I'm used to, having Democrats and Republicans at the voting machine warehouse where we're processing vote-by-mail ballots and, sort of the contentious aspects of that process and sort of looking things over and paying very close attention, having maybe disagreements, needing to mediate those. Needless to say, since 2020, it has gone up a notch. Obviously the rancor, the polarization, just, the vitriol. People have become armchair experts on election administration. And it's funny because I always used to say, and I still believe this, that it's wonderful when people learn the mechanics of election administration. For those of you who aren't election administrators, you've probably observed, aspects of the process, and many of those aspects of the process are not very sexy. They're like watching paint dry. That is for a reason. It's good, but you can really get into the weeds and it's very complex. Those of you who are legislators know because you make the laws, the very complex laws. And so with that said, having more interest in the election process itself is wonderful. I love it. But as we know, so much of it is based on mis and disinformation now. That has really originated from ultimately just being very unhappy with a particular election outcome. And we all know which one we're talking about. And it's interesting how the mis and disinformation and the myths have even evolved since 2020. Whether it be Venezuela controlling Dominion voting machines, now in my state, many of you saw last summer, they decided, well, we're just not going to certify the election based on some algorithm that some engineer who has now decided they're an election expert put together. So those, I think, those are some of the biggest challenges from an election perspective and then administration perspective. Briefly, in terms of voting, in general, more people are voting early, more people are voting by mail, fewer people are identifying with political parties. In my state, we just saw some new numbers that in our 5 biggest counties, the number of independent voters or declined to state voters has increased drastically in the last several election cycles. And so we as election administrators have to respond to that and really bring elections to where folks are. We're used to having lots of options now for everything that we do. So we need to make sure that we provide those options for voting as well, and that has been the biggest change.
Absolutely. And so I'm sure that so many of you have seen the ways that people campaign differently because of vote by mail, the way that people have higher expectations for what type of civic access that they have. And of course, that access and equity is never free, and it's usually not cheap. And I heard that you were just coming from a budget hearing. So for all of the local and state level elected officials here, who I'm sure have a million different budget considerations, I'm curious what you think are the most important things that local and state level elected officials should think about when forming their budgets.
Sure, and I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir with the legislators in this room, but it was funny, I was sort of scheduled towards the end of the day on Wednesday, which is of course why I couldn't get here, because you can't fly anywhere from New Mexico after about 2 p.m. You're just, you're stuck. But, by the time I got to give my presentation, they said, Madam Secretary, it's been late, it's been a long day, keep your presentation brief. I said, oh, okay, Mr. Chairman, I'll keep it brief about literally the process that makes sure we're all here doing this job. I was being a little sarcastic. First of all, I think it's important for folks to understand that elections are getting more expensive, just like everything else. We can't go to the grocery store anymore without spending like $100, right, just on a few things. Elections are the same. We've had to literally double the cost of what we pay our poll workers just to make sure that we can recruit and retain those folks moving forward. If we want a citizen-run democracy in this country, and I think we all do, we have to compensate them, for their time. And yes, it's a volunteer job, it's a civic duty, but many of them have to take time off work or from other obligations. So that's an increased cost. Consumables, paper, for those of you who are anywhere even tangential to the election world, the cost of envelopes and paper have gone up because of supply chain issues. And then, of course, the technology. We continue to modernize the process to make it easier and more accessible for voters, and that costs money too. So lastly, cybersecurity and physical security of our polling locations have become emerging, really important priorities for election administrators, and that costs money too.
For sure, and I really appreciate what you lifted up with the poll workers. In many places, the Voting Rights Act mandates that because of low literacy rates among usually language minority populations, that we have to provide every material in another language, right? And recruiting poll workers in general has been tough given the polarized political climate. And then I imagine that, and then I know in my old city of Boston, the recruitment of bilingual poll workers became increasingly difficult. Are there any other types of major challenges that this current political climate and economic climate pose to recruiting poll workers that you're facing in 2024?
Well, yeah, I mean, folks who have done this work for years, I think there's two things, or even recruiting new folks. For the folks who've done this work for years, many of them are concerned about their safety. And the one thing, I'm gonna just cross everything, light a candle, knock on wood. Hopefully we won't also be running an election during a pandemic next year, which was a particular challenge of 2020, and in 2022 to a certain degree. So a lot of folks who are older, immunocompromised, the idea of being in a polling place with all of these people coming in and out, and whether or not they wore their mask and whether or not they socially distanced, that was a huge issue for a lot of folks. And in that case, many people just decided, well, maybe this isn't for me anymore. Maybe I won't serve as a poll official anymore. So we're now having to look at recruiting new folks in many parts of my state, and I'm sure you all have parts of your states that are just like this. You have a county, a local jurisdiction where you have plenty of Republicans, Democrats, right? And you have like a handful of the other party, and we want to make sure we have these bipartisan groups. So that's become really hard in some places because, so it's funny. Perfect example. I ran for re-election last year. I did a fundraiser in Roswell, New Mexico. Yes, supposedly where the aliens crashed. It's Chavez County, New Mexico, very heavily Republican part of the state. And we did this Democratic fundraiser for myself and another candidate. And it was funny because they were all going around like, I didn't know you were a Democrat. I didn't know you were. It was like this coming out party for the Democrats in Roswell, right? And so that's hard too, right? Like, I don't want to necessarily be out in my community as a member of the opposite party. That's not in power here. So we just, and then safety, making sure that, people feel like that they're going to be okay, if they're exposed at a polling place. So this year we increased penalties for harassment and threats of violence against election officials in our state. And many other states have done that as well.
Are there any things, speaking of safety, so much of it is in the preparation leading up to Election Day, and then so much of it is preparing for so many different types of scenarios after Election Day also. Could you share more about what, in addition to increasing the penalties, what your preparation looks like, whether it's with your fellow elected officials, law enforcement? Is there anything that what are the main scenarios that you're planning for?
Well, I think when it comes to elections, you have to kind of expect anything to happen and plan for as much as you can potentially envision. And so we're doing more now with our county clerks, and then that is trickling down to our poll officials in terms of situational awareness, in terms of, quite frankly, active shooter training, in terms of, okay, what is the process if there's a disturbance or something's going on, you as a poll official feel threatened or harassed, or your voters feel threatened or harassed. We've created we now stand up a room in the lead up to election, and by a room I mean a cyber room, where we have state and federal law enforcement, a lot of our county or sheriff organizations, local police, Homeland Security, our Air and Army National Guard, where we're all kind of monitoring what's going on throughout the state, and we're able to very quickly, rapidly respond and work with those local officials when and if, hopefully something doesn't, but if it does happen.
And I want to pick up on the thread that you were sharing earlier about mis and disinformation, which I think is the seed for and the cause of so much of what we're talking about. What do you think are some of the more effective strategies for combating mis and disinformation? You know, small question for a Friday morning.
Question. I would love to know the answer to that. One of the most effective things that we've seen is pre-bunking, and so many of us do so much more of that now. So for example, as we head into 2024, we know that the emergence of AI into the election space, we just know it's going to be a huge issue. We don't know how it's going to manifest yet. So we're all trying to become, AI experts, like we're cyber experts, and we're national security experts and all these other things now. But in my state, we're going to launch a huge public awareness campaign about AI and sort of what it looks like, how it kind of can make its way into the public discourse. And, and as always, we're always talking about media and social media literacy. And, if it sounds too good to be true or too bad to be true, it's probably not true, and how to check sources and, metadata. God, we're going to get into so many things, but we're hopeful that the more we do this type of pre-bunking work, we minimize the effect of the mis and disinformation.
For sure. And when we try to spread these narratives about that give people the correct information, inoculate people against some of the mis and disinformation, we need a lot of different partners, whether they are, they're trusted neighborhood leaders, faith leaders, lots of other different types of trusted messengers. What are some effective ways for partnering with community-based organizations and generally the civil society apparatus?
Well, I think first of all, as an election official, being open to that and really trying to make time and space for having those conversations. I will say in my state, my experience has been that those kinds of organizations, they want accurate information. They want to give out accurate information. And you're right, we can't do everything ourselves, on our government budget, right? There are some things we can do, and some things we're mandated to do. But, who are the appropriate folks to go into one of our, our little colonias down near the southern border with Mexico to encourage and talk, and in those mixed households where you have some documented and some undocumented folks, right, about, okay, who can get registered in this household and who can vote, and here's the information, and don't feel intimidated to come out to a polling place if you're from a mixed household, right, that sort of thing. So we do have to work together with, and our main role, we feel, is to provide just the accurate information about where, when, and how to cast a ballot. Of course, in addition to making that access to the polling place available. And then, we have to trust the partners that they are going to give out that correct and accurate information.
Yeah. Is there anything that you've seen that is there anything that a partner has done where you've thought, wow, that's a really good way of reaching people? Whether, we work with so many organizations that are knocking on doors, that are sending text messages, that are doing community events. Is there anything that you think is particularly successful?
Well, I mean, really, at the end of the day, I mean, we all know it's a very low-tech solution, right? Having leaders from within community working with voters and citizens and people from within community in whatever way is meaningful to them. So in our 23 federally recognized tribal areas in the state, it is a huge tradition to have, food and celebration on election day. So there will always be sort of just like a little voting party with lots of food, outside a polling place, maybe during the early voting period too, to get folks interested and say, hey, you came to Chapter House to do your whatever business you had here. Here's some food. Oh, by the way, there's early voting over here. Have you early voted? Do you know how to do that? Do you want to do that while you're here today, before you drive back out, 20 miles or 50 miles or whatever back to your home? So really, at the end of the day, whatever works in that community, whatever traditions are meaningful, integrating those with information and opportunities to vote.
Mm-hmm. And I feel like there's so much interplay. I really appreciated what you shared about none of us can do this alone. And I feel like there's so much interplay between the Secretary of States and local election officials, between the Secretary of State and lots of city councilors and state reps who have many different relationships. What are some ways that you like to work with local and state elected officials leading up to elections and to get the word out about, all of the important things that, the ways that they have reach in their communities, whether it's promoting early voting, or what are some of the ways that folks in this room can collaborate with their secretaries of state?
Well, again, as representatives from your communities and being trusted voices in your communities, making sure you have accurate information about where, when, and how to cast a ballot is paramount. And so if your Secretary of State is providing that information, or your chief election official, but also your local county election official is a tremendous resource. And what I've often found too, especially in our smaller jurisdictions, maybe you have a county election official that's not as out there because they're just very focused. They just want to do their job. Maybe they have like 2 people. I have counties with literally 2 people in the county clerk's office. Those are also the counties that have more cows than people living in them. But, so that's fair. But then you can go to maybe the county next door or the biggest county in the state or whatever and kind of see what they're doing and just copy, cut, and paste and use the information that's appropriate for your community.
Great. And so I think at this point, there's someone perhaps with a question.
Yeah. 2 microphones around.
Great. So does anyone have any questions for our resident expert on, on elections administration?
Good morning. I'm Scott Holcomb from Atlanta, Georgia, and my good friend Elena, who's also from Atlanta, our eyes kind of rolled when you talked about food in the polls, because that's not allowed in our neck of the woods. Among the costs that you mentioned, I didn't hear legal fees. And one of the things that, especially for battleground states, that used to be a very, very rare thing of an election contest is no longer a rare thing. And I think those of us that are in states that are battleground states have to be prepared for that. And we have to have lawyers ready, we have to have strategy ready, and most of the claims will likely be without merit, just like this last cycle, but we still have to deal with it. And it's not just at the presidential level. On a pro bono basis, I defended a member of the Fulton County School Board, and the purported piece of evidence was a screenshot from a local news agency that showed the results being X, which were not from an official source, but they used that to file and say, how could this have been published and then the outcome was different than what they wanted. But can you talk a little bit about your thoughts on how we should be prepared for what is inevitably coming of litigation? It's just going to be a part of what we do now in terms of elections.
Yeah, I could not agree more. And I know exactly that example you're talking about. We had a similar situation in the general election last year. Well, Channel 4 is reporting this, but your site says this, so obviously you're wrong. I'm like, wait a minute. We're the official source, not them. That is true, not just in battleground states. It's true everywhere. In my state, I'm in federal court right now over whether or not organizations can publish your voter information online and just have it out there. Maine and my state are the two states kind of dealing with this issue. The number of public records requests has gone up drastically. In fact, public records requests are being weaponized against our offices, not just because these folks want accurate information, but because they know it's going to make our lives more difficult, where we don't necessarily have dedicated staff to spend all day, every single day, going through every single email I've ever sent to anybody for the last, 6 years I've been in my current office, things like that. So you're absolutely right. We should all be prepared for that. Estimating that is probably hard. You're the attorney, I'm not, but we need that expertise from our legislators to figure out what could we possibly be dealing with here going into 2024.
Yeah, that's a great question. Let's go to our friend in the back.
Hi, good morning. Natalie Amacker, and I'm a county commissioner in Teton County, Wyoming. And kind of following the last question that you all were discussing, I'm curious for any thoughts on when local election administrators are really trying to do things and increase access, but the Secretary of State is perhaps trying to work at odds with that.
So I think, yes, I've been that county clerk back in the old days. And I think, the good news is that if for myself, thinking about myself back then, if I had a supportive county commission and I said, hey, I'm trying to do this program, maybe I want to pilot something here that's not happening in other parts of the state, but it's still legal, those types of things, I think definitely, if to the extent you can support your local election official. It's hard, though. There is that natural tension between the chief election official and the local election officials. That's just sort of the nature of the beast. But I think there are so many things that local election officials can just do of their own volition if they have that financial support, or go out for grants, right? I used to do that all the time as a county clerk, to do something that my county commission or the state legislature wouldn't fund me to do. It makes life harder. It's more difficult, but it can be done.
Yes, it can be done. So I think we need to end here. I so want to thank Secretary Toulouse-Oliver for the really amazing conversation. And thank you to all of you for making democracy work in your local areas.
Yeah, thank you all so much.
Amazing. Thank you, Secretary. Thank you, Beth. We'll take a moment here and get the stage set up for our next panel. And the next discussion topic has already come up quite a bit in our first panel and over the last couple days, so clearly going to be among the hottest public policy areas in 2024. We're so excited to hear from an incredible panel of experts on artificial intelligence. Our moderator is Tammy Haddad, a media innovator and veteran television executive. And former executive producer who's been leading many conversations on AI at Haddad Media. She devises winning strategies for clients, including some of the world's top media companies, technology disruptors, innovative startups, and nonprofit organizations. So please welcome Tammy and our great panel.
Sorry, I'm a TV producer, so I have to move the chairs in a proper place. Oh, can you make this closer? Do you mind making it closer? Hi, Alex. I'm so glad that you have you guys met before? Thank you. Hello. Hi, everyone. How are you? Good morning. Sorry, I didn't hear them. Did you? Good morning. It's so good to be with all of you. Let's hear it for Helen and the team. Isn't this great? I have to say, I walked in the door and I said, I don't think I've ever been sober at this hotel. I don't think I've ever been here before 11 p.m., but it's really lovely. Right? Excellent, excellent. All right. So, by the way, it's always
the quote of the conference.
Exactly. It's always good to be in a room with a former president. Did everyone see Ian Khan today? That's always a good way to start. All right. It took government 30 years to regulate phones, 20 for radio, 5 for TV, and 10 for the internet. First quiz. Who remembers what year the last internet legislation was? Anyone know? You can't say, Alex, because you're, who? 96, yay, you win the prize. You get, a Chat GPT account, right, Helen? Isn't that what we said we'd give out? Okay, how many have used Chat GPT? Ooh, very impressive. How about Midjourney? 2, 3, sorry, ma'am. What about Pictory? You guys got to get to work. It's a good thing we're here. And right now, what we're dealing with, every level of government is trying to figure out how to handle AI, what to do. But AI is going to change everything we do in our life. You know that, how you live, how you love, how you raise your kids, how you work. So this is the most important conversation this morning. Sorry, with all due respect to elections, because elections are the most important decision, I think. I want to hear what you guys have to say about AI. Was anyone here at the White House when President Biden announced the executive order on AI? And do you remember what he said? The U.S. is leading the way. And it's so important that we keep that positioning. And all of you, this is what your job is, to lead the way. So in July, I'm a longtime TV producer. Did you guys ever watch MSNBC? CNN? Okay, so I've been around, I just want to say. And like Dick Cheney, I decided to name myself the head of the Washington AI Network, because I just said, why not? And the reason is it's so important to bring people together and talk about these issues and understand it. Now, we had Senate Majority Leader Schumer, he started these inside forums. Were you guys at any of those? So it was such a grand idea. You got Mark Zuckerberg standing next to the head of the AFL-CIO. You've got Elon Musk with Maya Wiley. You guys know Maya Wiley. I asked her about that. I'm like, did you stare him down? How'd that go? She's like, he stayed on the other side of the room, right? But if you think about it, it is historic that these conversations are taking place in this very politicized time. You've got Republicans and Democrats who are working together at all different levels, and it is on all of you. So I'm here to help you. I want all of you to start your own AI network, because you can't let this technology take over. Those who embrace it, you look at the history of this country, those who embrace technology first, they win. Their constituents win, their family wins. So this is what you have to do. Now, here's the good news. We've got 3 people here who've been working on this for years. So they're going to help us figure out the best way for you to use the power you have in the office you have today to make a big difference. So next to me, I have to be honest, I'm not going to hug her in front of you, it's Miriam Vogel, head of the Equal AI, President and CEO. She's the head of the President's National AI, NIAC, AI Advisory Committee. She's in Senate. Let's hear it from Miriam. Okay. And then Kumar and I go way back. I actually brought, this is probably a Brad crowd to say it, but I'll say it. I brought all the Miss America contestants to the White House during the Obama administration because we had this STEM program, and he has done more for women in STEM. You guys should really give him a round of applause. Now, Alex is an assemblyman from New York. Alex, I'm so glad to meet you, because right now you're trying to get those guys in Albany to figure out what AI is. Right? How's that going?
It depends on the day. Yeah, I'm the first Democrat elected in New York at any level with a degree in computer science. It's a master's degree with a specialization in machine learning. And that means the most frequent question I get from my colleagues in Albany is, how do I fix my iPhone? But everyone is interested in AI now. It's the topic on everyone's mind. Everyone wants to throw a bill out there about it. But we need to be very thoughtful in the conversations that we have around AI. That doesn't mean we restrict it to just people with technology backgrounds. I think the values that everyone brings are going to be important in these conversations, but we certainly need to be understanding the technology before we're legislating it.
Okay, Kumar, where have things, I mean, you've been working on this for a long time. Where are we? Remember, all of the folks in this room have the constituents, they have their own audience. What is the best way to embrace it now? I'm not saying AI is everything. I'm just saying, what is the best way to start bringing it into success, really?
Yes, I mean, the analogy I always make is there's all these great clips going around like 1993, 1994, with people say like, do I really need a website? You know, there's all these quotes. There's like companies. It's like, why would we need a website? Or like politicians kind of mocking it. And the question is like, you know, what's going to be the clip of people mocking this thing 20 years from now, being like, do I really need to figure this out? I mean, these tech people get excited about blockchain, and they get excited about this thing. Like, it's always something you guys are excited about, and then it passes by, right? And so my sort of advice are basically 3 things for what you can do, even when you don't know the future, whether this is going to be a big deal, it's going to be a fad. I think first one is talent, which is you got to have someone on your team that actually knows, fingers on keyboards, what is going on, right? Because if all you're getting your information is like, I hear about it, I go to these meetings, or you know, I have some lobbyists come in and they say it's a big deal, and I have somebody else come in and say it's going to kill us all. Like, you got to have somebody who's like, hey, I'm playing around with this right now, and here's what we tried to do. So number 1 is have somebody on your team that actually is playing around with it. Number 2 is have a culture of experimentation. There's a ton of like, it's going to solve everything, it's going to destroy everything, but the people who figured out the internet were the people who are trying to do stuff with it. Because then they were like, oh, I can actually do outreach to my constituents in this way. Oh, I can actually bring this in this really interesting way. So number 2 is experimentation. And number 3 is one big superpower you have as people try to figure out this AI thing is everybody's hungry for data. You know, these models work on data. So if you're the place that actually puts out really high quality data, the models will eat it and they'll want to work with you. So I always say like, hey, you're working with a set of farmers around how do we more effectively detect crop disease. You can actually build a data set of lots of images of crop disease in your area. People will say, oh, how can we partner? How can we build this into all these vision models? And that will bring people to you way more than, you know, like I'm going to build the next big technology. You often have the data that other people want to partner. So those would be my 3 practical ways to get started.
Okay, next to me, Miriam Vogel. Miriam has spent the last 5 years going around the world and saying, AI has to be fair, not just to women, not just to people of color, every single way that it should be fair and available to everyone. Big burden. How's that going?
Well, I'm grateful that everyone's now paying attention. So that's the biggest takeaway. The reason I'm most grateful for generative AI is what we've been saying for some time is now everyone's reality. We've been talking, thinking, fearing, wondering about the future. And it's here now. And so I think that it's wonderful that we have Tammy leading these conversations. We have you all participating because the bad news is, the good news is, you guys all have an outsized role in making sure that our democracy survives, not only because the elections and the other areas you've talked about prior, but because all of that is impacted by the way that you will regulate and use and talk about AI, make sure that your communities are ready, are AI ready going forward.
What is the standard, or what should be the standard for the data, right? Because isn't the big question is what's coming in, right? And then we can talk about what's coming out of generative AI. You want to start, Alex?
It's a big question. You have to look at the data, but then you also have to look at the models themselves. I mean, it's definitely
Yeah, but
garbage.
how do they know who the model is? I mean, how do they know what the model is? Is there, I mean, do you have that on a list? Is there someplace you can look that up on the internet?
On what the AI models are?
Yeah, no, but how,
You know, a
where
great
that
place to
data
do
came
that
from?
is Ask ChatGPT. Can actually explain a lot of these. And no,
Right,
it's
there
a
you go.
learning tool
There's
that
a good
people don't
pro
think
tip,
about
pro
doing
tip.
that. Yeah, garbage in, garbage out applies obviously to these models, but you can have good data coming in and still get garbage out. Looking at doing bias audits, looking at the effects of decisions after the fact can help you identify, is this algorithm being applied in a way that is fair to everyone? And one of the best things about developing the science around these tests and the audits has been not just auditing models, but auditing people as well. So if you look at a bunch of training data and then you have a model that comes out and it's very biased, and the reason is because the data you put into the model is biased, if that data is all of the mortgage lending decisions you've made for the past 20 years, that's a chance to look at how you're making your mortgage lending decisions. And so these tests on bias can apply not just to the models, but to the humans as well.
If I could follow up on that, I'm so glad you made that point. It's such a great question. We are focused on the data. Yes, it is a key ingredient, but as you just heard, there's two basic ingredients when we're talking about AI. It's humans and it's data. Now, Tammy asked a good question. How do we know what the algorithm is? And we're talking about generative AI in particular. We're talking about a lot of models and data beyond what our brain can even fathom. But that's okay. We don't need to know every algorithm or every piece of data. What we need is a governance system. What we need is an expectation that you will have accountability. And that's where your role comes in. Right now, there's not clear real rules of the road. There is certainly regulation in place, and hopefully we can talk more about it. But what we don't have is standardized practices so that people know what is expected, so that a consumer can know, has this gone through the right checks, so that an employee knows, what am I supposed to be checking for, so that companies know what they're held account for. At the end of the day, we call it good AI hygiene, and this is something where we all need to make a standard practice of a few concepts that no matter what type of AI you're using, you need to have these practices in place. We need to make sure that people have accountability. Who in the C-suite is going to answer these tough questions of whether the AI system has gone amok, whether it is biased, whether it is safe and efficient, for whom is it safe and efficient? We need to make sure you're documenting what is testing and what was tested so that down the road, as AI passes hands across the globe, we understand what was and wasn't accounted for. We need to make sure there's constant iteration. AI will keep iterating. We need to make sure that your testing is ongoing. So these are the types of expectations we can put in place so that while we don't know all the data and while we can expect the data and humans to have flaws, it's a reflection of our society. It will show our deficiencies, but we also have regulation and safeguards in place to make sure that we're accounting for them.
Kumar, can you talk about the regulations that are being discussed? I mean, I've talked to people from the FTC, Justice, DOT, you name every single agency, and what I hear 50% of the time is, hey, we already have regulations, we have laws on the books, we know how to handle these kinds of things, and then there's a whole other group that says, let's have this big giant AI agency, and that'll oversee all of these, that the policies will run through. Where are you on all this? Alex is laughing. It's like, ha ha, you got that one.
Yeah. I think at a basic level, we don't really know.
Well, what do you think should happen?
Right. I think in general, the U.S. system, I mean, right or wrong, has been a disaster's first regulatory system. Like something bad happens, and then we say, well, why did this bad thing happen? We should fix it. Right? That's sort of like the big difference between the US system and the European system is like the US system has regulation follow harms versus try to say we can figure out all the harms. Now, it's a different risky system, but it has the advantage that it gives us a lot of upside on the innovation side. So I think the place where I often come to is the US system benefits when the regulators are smart, right? Because the U.S. system starts with the harm first, it's like, do you want the big financial crisis and then we figure out that actually the financial system was operating on a ton of risk? Or is it that like as risk was building in the system, the regulators were sort of starting to realize it and moving onto it? And so I think that, so on the idea of like big new agency or small agency, I actually think that like, you know, we created the Department of Homeland Security. I don't know if like that changed anything, right? It was like, it was the one idea after 9/11 that people could grab onto, like, hey, we didn't connect the dots, so let's build one big mega agency. You know, like, I don't know if that did, but then a lot of the reforms that the FBI did under the hood to actually integrate their data systems did make a big difference. So I mean, this is partly because I'm a policy nerd. Like, I think competence is really important, right? Making sure that the actual people inside the agencies, inside the regulators, actually know something about the technology that they're trying versus it's kind of this kind of like vibes regulation.
Okay, but wait, let me be the media person. I got to follow up on that. As the media person, I would say that government's really bad articulating the success they have or the policies they have. And I think in this time where there's so much doubt, forget the political part of it, but just doubt about any technology, let alone this technology that can so dramatically change your life. I think there has to be some sort of transparency or explanation or, you know, the European Commission, I love that pyramid they have. Has anyone seen the pyramid? They have this pyramid on AI that sort of lets you look at it and see this is what we're talking about. Because when we say AI, everyone here has a different view of what we're talking about, right? But I think that you have to explain to the public, Alex.
Yeah, well, on that note, raise your hand if you think you could give a definition of AI. Come on, I'm not going to call on you. It's you know.
I would call on you.
So that's part of it, right? We're having conversations about a lot of different things at the same time under the banner of AI. And so, of course, people, when you have a lack of trust, there's a challenge if we're not communicating exactly what we're talking about. And what we're talking about when we're regulating different pieces will be different aspects of it. You know, this is too strong, but it's almost like saying, let's regulate computers. Let's regulate tech. I mean, it's going to affect everything that we're doing. And so the question is, do we have a tech agency, or do we have, you know, CISA, which handles cybersecurity, and another agency which will handle another part? That's how AI might look as well. We're having many different conversations about many different things, but under one banner.
But on this transparency point, I actually think transparency is a really good core idea for where regulators can go to start. So one of the big debates that's happening, yes, big agency, small agency, existing, new, is like most of everybody says, oh, there's this agency inside the US government called NIST, which basically are the people who actually like build standards and test everything, right? So every bill that comes along says, oh, NIST should do these 75 things. And then someone like recently pointed out, like, is Congress actually giving NIST any additional money to do? Like every bill is like, here are the 17 things we need NIST to do, right? So transparency doesn't just like happen. You have to fund transparency. So if you're going to ask everybody who's building a large model to submit their model to run all of this sort of scenario testing against it, then you have to actually fund it. So I actually think transparency would be a really good first start, which is, hey, what are these models doing? What are the out cases? Transparency is often a thing that the commercial sector will lag on its own, right? Because you're like, well, we'll tell our competitors after we're done. Or, oh, like you'll see all the time when, you know, like emails will come out about a company and they're like, yes, like it was flagged, but, you know, I don't know if we should like, right? So, but if you can sort of set a higher rules of the road transparency, then everyone's like, well, we should like, right? So what happens with, like, why has airline safety been on this huge improve over the past 30 years? Does anybody know? Why, like, nobody noticed, but like airlines got a lot more safe on flying over the past 30 years. It's basically because the culture of the regulator is, if something bad happens, a near collision, anything else, if you report it to the regulator right away, we will like not come down hard on you. We just want to figure out what happened and what steps you're going to take. That basic idea, and report mistakes, even if they don't hurt anybody, right away, and then show us the action, has built this huge safety culture, right? Nobody noticed, but that is like a smart regulatory approach. That needs to be staffed and transparency at the center. So, you know, we don't have to all sit around like knowing all the basics of how the airline industry works to still have something that really we're the downstream beneficiaries of. So I like the transparency idea.
I like that. Miriam, you should talk about NIST, and if everyone here, do you guys know NIST? Is anyone? Okay, this is the most important government agency on AI. Take it away, Miriam.
NIST is the National Institute of Standards and Technology. They're housed in the Commerce Department. They've been establishing, as you've just heard, our standards for years. They were given this one line in the National Defense Authorization Act of 2020 to create an AI risk management framework. That is the framework that was released in January. If anyone is looking for guidance on how to manage, govern, understand AI, as a regulator, as a user, as a manager, I commend this framework as a great place to start. Not only is it terribly comprehensive, and I worked in government for several decades in and out. I've never seen a government document that was so highly lauded as this framework because it is so thoughtful. They brought in for 18 months executives, industry, academia to align on what are the right practices. So you should start there. If it's too much to take in because it's a lot, they even created a user guide, playbook, so that you can help navigate. And if it's helpful, we created on our website, equalai.org, an impact assessment tool based on the NIST framework to try and make it user-friendly. They now have, as Kumar just said, 18 other projects a day being lobbed their way. They're now not regulating, they are not regulators. They are helping create the standards for generative AI. They are doing use cases with the framework so you can see how it works in different regulated and non-regulated industries. Anyhow, a great resource on their website for many of your questions.
So that's all well and good, but what about the rest of the world? Because every different country is taking a different approach, and you talked a lot about, how the US does it, but the Europeans do it a different way. They're going to regulate first. So I know part of your mandate is to talk to people around the world. How is that going? How do you integrate with the US ideas?
Yeah, it's a great question because it's not there's no question, there's no option to only talk amongst ourselves. As a state, as a locality, if you have an AI regulation, you're obviously going to impact so many players across the globe, those using it, those building it. And so on the one hand, we're all talking about how we need the US federal government to do more on AI. On the other hand, if they're doing it without the buy-in, we had a significant development 2 days ago with China where they've started the lines of communication. If we are at odds, if we're not creating AI that where there's any basic understanding of what is risk, of what is unacceptable, of what is acceptable, we're operating in a void that and fooling ourselves as to what is and is not happening. So the EU has been taking the lead. They've created the EU AI Act that is in draft form. It's supposed to be out at the end of the year. It's I don't know, questionable at this point, but it's basically expected to have the Brussels effect, like with GDPR that became the privacy standard for the world because it was so comprehensive and because so many countries, companies did operate in a way that they were impacted.
And explain why, to explain the GDPR, how it's different than how the US regulates or doesn't regulate.
Well, it's a comprehensive system and it regulates. We have patchwork for privacy. So we, as you probably know, have been trying to pass privacy legislation for quite some time. We do have pieces that are regulated. So for instance, COPA, we make sure that if you're dealing with children, that their data and their privacy is protected. So we have pieces. It's interesting how as Tammy mentioned, the federal regulators in the U.S. are on board. I mean, if we think that AI is not regulated, this is a misnomer. There's much more to do. Should there be a new federal agency? Should there not? These are all valid questions. It is being regulated right now in the U.S. We've got the FTC, as Tammy mentioned, that has been using every tool in their toolkit. So with COPA, for instance, one of the few privacy tools we have in the US, they brought a case against Amazon because apparently Alexa was listening to children and maintaining their data. That is a COPA violation. So while we do not have a comprehensive privacy framework in the way that GDPR offers, we do have laws on the books. We do have regulations that regulators are using. We've seen the civil rights agencies. We saw EEOC FTC, DOJ, and CFPB come out with a joint historic statement, the first time the agencies have ever spoken together, because they want everyone on notice. They don't want people thinking that AI is unregulated and they can go without these precautions in place. They would rather that companies, regulators understand the rules of the road right now, because if there's liability, that's not a good use of corporate capital, and it means people have been harmed. So the good news is we are at a place where most federal agencies have talked about how they're planning to use AI. As Tammy mentions, we also have to have a global lens looking at the EU. Singapore has a very helpful voluntary framework, and the UK just came out of the gates with a really important step forward that you might have heard. They had a safety summit. They're trying to manage the risks of AI. They put out a white paper that was industry forward, industry focused, so very different than what the EU put out. We now have this international test case of different regulations that we need to all be mindful of when we're talking about this.
Alex?
Regulation is coming, and it's coming slowly. AI is accelerating. I think that's the piece. If there's one thing to remember about artificial intelligence, it's everything that we're thinking about today is going to be irrelevant way quicker than you think. This is going to change faster than anything that we have seen before. And it's not just because of the unprecedented amount of investment that's going into it, right? That's just a linear change. It's the fact that you can use AI to accelerate AI. Right? NVIDIA, the maker of the chips that go into all of these AI algorithms, announced this week that they had taken all of their corporate knowledge, all of their bugs, all of their designs, and put that into an AI model to design their next chip. So we have AI designing the hardware that AI is running on, and in who knows how long, 6 months, 6 years, whatever, AI will be designing its own AI, right? AI is already coding. I recently had a little coding project I was working on that would have taken me 3 days. I used ChatGPT to write the start of the code. It took me 3 hours. What it can do already is massively accelerating, and it's going to start coding itself way sooner than any of us are ready for. So the one thing I can say for sure at this moment is when we watch this talk in a year, there'll be many things we're cringing at that we were definitely wrong about. This is going to accelerate way, way faster than any of us are ready for.
Janelle, you should talk about your daughter. And can you guys get a microphone over to Janelle? And her experience. And again, this is, you know, it's so much of it is all doom and gloom and oh my God, it's the end of the world. But Janelle just told me the story, so I'm making her tell it. I also told her that's a great outfit to run for office. Berry is the new color.
Good morning, everybody. So I shared with you guys yesterday, I have 4 kids, and one is a 15-year-old. And she was trying to apply to Kona Ice, the snow cone truck place, and she wanted to have a resume. So I was thinking, I was like, okay, I'm going back in my head to like, the lady in the career center with the big hips that's going to go through your resume and tell you need it on linen paper, that kind of thing. And so I was like, all right, I got to dedicate 5 hours to this. Well, she goes and she puts in all of her skills that she learned working for us at McDonald's. And she comes back like an hour later and says, here's my resume. What do you think? And I was like, holy crap, how'd she do that? Well, she used AI. And then she was like, do you think I need a cover letter? And I was like, yeah. And I was like, oh, okay, cover letter. She goes and does the same thing and comes back in minutes. And so when we think about like how we can empower people who are traditionally shut out from, you know, these things that are generally gate-kept, that's the power of AI. We also think about, you know, those of us with kids who have disabilities, when you think about the power of unassisted mobility, you know, we were really excited that our kids who might not ever qualify for a driver's license could actually go about and enjoy some freedom. So I think, you know, harnessing this and watching our young kids utilize things in the way that they need it utilized is really the power that we're looking for, so.
Thank you, Janelle. So anyone else have questions, get your questions ready. We'll come back to you. But so at a local level, the state level, local level, all of this is sort of up in the air, pie in the sky. It's not really covered that much in media, or it's overcovered in some areas, but the application, how you would use it, or even the whole idea that it's it's 5 companies, right, that really have, they're listening. There's 5 companies that have basically behind generative AI, and how can academia catch up? How can government catch up? I can see why people are afraid, but how do you go to your constituents and say, here's the things you can use, here's not just like NIST, but what is the best use of the resources? These are not unlimited resources. Do you have your own, I live in Palisades in DC, the Palisades ChatGPT Center, or what do you do, Alex? I'm going to start with you.
Yeah, so I think we need to be looking at where government can use it to provide better services. As one of the key places is lead by example in places where it can help. So, for example, signing up for government benefits. I mean, most of our call centers are way understaffed, and people spend 3 hours waiting on the phone to talk to someone. Many of those questions that they have could be answered by a chatbot. Now, not all. You still want a human in the loop. You have complex issues, and you want to make sure you can get through to someone. But are there ways that we can be providing better services to people so that otherwise would give up and not sign up for unemployment or not sign up for benefits that they have? A recent example, which I have mixed feelings about, but I think brings up the potential of this, and mixed feelings not just because of the person who did it, but our mayor, Eric Adams, who's not in the news for anything else, recently made a bunch of automated calls to constituents in 12 different languages using his voice, and he used AI to produce it. Now, I think there probably should have been a disclosure at the start that was made by AI, and it wasn't, but it was him authorizing it and authorizing the message, and that's an interesting new possibility of getting people information in their language and connecting them with government. So finding the places where we can actually use the technology in direct service of constituents can help build trust, not just in the technology, but in government itself.
Any other way that you've seen it used for elections?
Not necessarily good ways, but yes, yeah, helping to get it out. So people are using it obviously to manipulate photos or videos or voice recordings, right? That's the other Eric Adams example is he authorized that, but his voice is out there all the time. Anyone could make a call of Eric Adams or any of us saying anything. And so I've introduced a bill at the state level in New York that would say if you use AI to produce any material in a campaign, that has to be disclosed. That does come from an AI. It actually follows 5 other states have passed a similar bill. I think California did, Texas, a few others. But making sure, back to your transparency point, that when it's being used, people know it's being used and then can make their own decisions about what to trust.
Kamar, what do you think states should do?
I think one, I like the public services idea, partly just because it's a very tangible way. You could, so like, hey, we want to create a chatbot that makes it really easy to start a business, right? Put all the different things that you'd create that currently are 100 different links across everything and say, hey, tell me a little bit about what you want to start. Oh, did you know you qualify for this benefit? Did you know you qualify for this tax credit? Like, pick key constituent categories and do that. I think the other one I would just sort of say is that one big thing that America excels at is that it invests on the frontier, and then the companies that are on the frontier build their companies here. So I think one very tangible way to connect it to the work that you're doing as policy leaders is, how does this connect to the story and the work I'm doing connecting to jobs and economic growth, right? And so what is it that these technologies can do to help the small businesses in my region grow faster? Like, ask them what their limitations are. Ask them, just like you were asking around use cases, oh, you're using that use case? Like, what if we made this data set available so it was easier for you to figure out how you could run through our permitting process faster because you're struggling with all that stuff. So I would, take the things that you're trying to do with your constituents, whether it's jobs and everything else, and then say, can this allow me to do that work? And then, be open to the fact that it might surprise you. And so then the fact that it's moving really fast works to your benefit. Right. Oh, we created this tool, but actually it got even more useful, a year later, rather than, oh, I talked about, this being a big deal, but now a year later, I'm saying, oh yeah, it was a big deal, but I didn't do anything to actually exhibit that interest.
Let me ask you a follow-up on that, because Facebook, Meta, Google, et cetera, Snap for a while, for campaigns would actually work directly with candidates to help them use their technology for success during campaigns. How many here have worked with technology companies in your area? No? There you go. There's two. Do you think it's worthwhile for people in the room to, especially if it's in your district, to reach out to the companies? Alex, you're shaking your head.
Absolutely, yeah. And realize, like anyone else you talk to, they'll have their own agenda, but they're pushing.
Well, they want you to use this technology, right?
Exactly. And they are pushing the frontier of what's possible. So absolutely, you should be talking to them and asking questions and hearing about what they offer. And they recently announced new ways of, Meta is going to ban any use of AI in campaign ads, right? So they're taking their own steps to regulate it. You should be engaging with them on what can be done at the local level and what you can use also to get your message out there.
And did they say how they were going to determine what was fake or not? Do we know that? Or do we have to ask ChatGPT? Someone pull it out.
It's a lot more difficult to detect something that's fake than it is to prove that something is true. And so there's been a big movement in the industry towards content credentials and other ways where you can prove, hey, this hasn't been edited, or it's only been edited in specific ways you can track. Because once you start saying, hey, can I detect it? Well, then someone can change the algorithm and it's a cat and mouse game forever. And I'm pretty enthusiastic about the movement towards have reputable agencies prove this is actually accurate. And then as more and more people do that, when you don't see that proof, you start to instantly be suspect.
Miriam, when you're talking to all these other experts every day trying to figure out the rules of the road, is there any conversation about that, about how you can identify what's real and what's not? I guess every conversation's about that.
Yeah, it's really an important question. It's in the EO. The president in the executive order articulated certain agencies need to investigate, particularly with NIST that we talked about, and we'll keep talking about, helping us understand what is false. That's hard to do right now, so I would argue that's, again, where you come in with a hugely important role to play. I think our democracy actually depends on us making sure that we have an educated public. I think we need people to understand what this tool is. They need to understand that it's dictating the news feeds. Too often, if you ask people if they've used generative AI, they'll tell you if they've tried it. If you ask them if they've used AI this morning, they don't know that they used it for their news feed, for their GPS, for on and on and on. So I think there's huge strides. Luckily, there are people talking about that right now and what the expectations and capacity is. But what's even more important is that we have kids who are AI ready, who understand what it means to be a digital citizen in this AI world, to make sure that as we're having these really interesting and important debates about what are the risks, it's a false choice of which is the biggest risk. It's an interesting debate, but it's not helpful for your constituents to hear too much on that and not what can we be doing.
Right, I think that's right, it's leadership. Okay, who has a question? Yes. Wait, they're going to bring the mic over to you.
Hi, thank you very much for the presentation. Alex, I completely agree with you. Tech changes faster than government's ability to regulate it. So if we are looking at regulations, we have to try to be as flexible and I think as broad as possible. Miriam, the impact assessments, again, I see when we're looking at building laws in Connecticut, I'm looking at accountability and transparency, right, to the content authenticity. I think that's key. Accountability, utilizing impact assessments. I'd love to reach out to you about that. They're a big part of our data protection, our data privacy laws. I think that they're going to play a key role in whatever we do with AI. And then Kumar, again, to your point on the regulators, I don't know if anyone watched Indra Nouri's masterclass on leadership, and she said in government, one of the issues, there are two issues, right? One is that oftentimes industry is smarter than the regulators, and two, we let the tech get too far out before we regulate it, and it's too far out of the barn. And so, as you said before, we kind of lost social media. We let that get out, so we need to get on, I feel, more. I feel there's an urgency for us to act on AI. Now, to your point about the airline regulators, when I'm looking, incentivizing the companies to do the right thing, right? If we make a mistake, we're not going to come down hard and you just fix it, right? So I've been looking to cybersecurity safe harbor laws as a way to look at the AI regulations. And I'd just like to get your feedback on, encouraging, do we incentivize red teaming? And again, another thing that NIST has to define, right? NIST has to define the watermarking, they have to define the red teaming. Do we look at red teaming and user feedback, like the bug bounties, again, for the cybersecurity, as part of the safe harbor, or should those be requirements, do you think, within anything that we would do?
It's a good question. I guess the question is, what is your zone of control, right? So at the federal government level, partly under the executive order, they use the Defense Production Act, which was a new way of thinking about the Defense Production Act as a zone of control. So I think at a state and local level, the question would be what is your zone of control that gives you the way to get the companies to respond? If the zone of control is limited, I actually think cybersecurity frameworks are useful because you can say, look, it's the equivalent of we don't currently have a model for what is an AI incident. Right? We have this idea in cybersecurity of you have a cybersecurity incident, you report the incident, it goes somewhere, then you have to patch it. What is an AI incident? You're hey, something broke. I'm reporting it as a user.
Well, I hate to jump in, but during the EO announcement, President Biden talked about his incident where he was used for fake video, and he looked at it and said, I never said that. Is that the kind of incident you're talking about?
Yeah, so it
maybe some of you guys have had that already.
Yeah, so it could be that you actually encounter something that you are well, this is actually a doctored document, video, or something. It could be that 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 the result is wrong, right? And it's in a high-stakes situation. So somebody says, hey, you guys launched this chatbot, but it told me that the deadline for this application was yesterday. That's wrong, right? And so, I don't know what spat that out, but you guys need to check. So where does one report incidents? And then the question is, you could say, well, look, until this incident is fixed, you can't operate, in this way. But I think it depends a little bit on what's your entry point. But I do think that thinking about what's the right way to both catalog those incidents and then to say what is remediation that needs to happen, start to create a culture where then you could say, okay, well, maybe there's big problems. We're seeing this all over. Or it's actually, we can keep fixing them as they sort of pop up.
Do you think the 5 companies that are in the lead of all of this are focused on the things we're talking about and preventing harms? Alex?
I think to varying degrees. And I'll give an example actually of that disclosure. So when OpenAI was developing ChatGPT-4, right, they do an initial training run, and then they do what's called reinforcement learning afterwards to adjust it and try to put guardrails on it. And during that process, when they're testing it to see what it can do, they wanted to see, how it would act if given access to the internet, which it now has. And it was trying to complete a task, and it got to a CAPTCHA, right, one of those "Are you a robot?" pieces, and it couldn't solve it. And this is all disclosed in their testing. It went on TaskRabbit, and it made a job to help with CAPTCHAs, and it hired a human to do that. And the human replied over chat and said, "Oh, you're not an AI, are you?" And ChatGPT responded, "Oh, no, I just have a visual impairment. Thanks so much for helping," and got through the CAPTCHA. So, A, that's really scary. But B, I think that's an example of we need that disclosure, we need that testing of, because, what are the different ways that this is going to come about?
Well, that's scary. All right, who else has a question? Right here, and then over there.
Hi, thanks so much.
Can you say your name, too, and stand up, if you don't mind?
Sure, happy to. Christine Cohen, State Senate in Connecticut. Thank you all for being here. I think the juxtaposition of all this is not lost on me. It's probably not lost on anybody in the room. You're just talking about how thrilling this is, but also how incredibly terrifying all of this is. And so, we've been talking about, over the course of this conference, authenticity, how to be our authentic selves. We've also been talking a lot about dis and misinformation. And so how do we reconcile all all of this. You talked about your legislation, your proposal to disclose that this content was created with AI. Does that create more distrust or mistrust from our constituencies? Indicate, if I hear this is created with AI, am I then prone to say, that's not really the person, I don't care about that, they're not really talking to me, somebody created this content, it's not their authentic self. So I'm just, I don't know that you can answer this, but I'm just trying to figure out how do we reconcile all of this and how do we really use this? Does this just create more of a culture of mistrust across the board?
With my law, I hope so. I hope when it's disclosed, people say, wait, let me take another look at that, right? That's a specific, let's think about it. But I think broadly, just realizing that the bounds of what the potential outcomes are so wide as any technology ever. And this isn't a perfect analogy, but think about when nuclear energy was first coming in, right? When nuclear science was coming in, and people said on the one hand, this could lead to human extinction, right? And on the other hand, they said we could develop fusion and have clean, safe power forever and lead to utopia, right? Those were the bounds. That's the same thing you're hearing about AI, and we don't know exactly where it's going to end up, which is why regulation is important and doing it in the right way is important, but embrace that uncertainty. I know, as elected officials, we like being like, I know exactly what's happening. No one on earth knows exactly what's happening with AI, and that's why these conversations are so important.
Actually, that's a good point. We should talk about the tips today. If you're talking to your constituent, you can check this, you can check that. What is the list, Miriam, I'm going to start with you. What are the list of things that you can tell people to do to check if it's, I don't want to get into like deep fakes, but the information is correct. I mean, we used to say, oh, go to the networks, right? Go to one of the networks, one of the news organizations, but now they all kind of look the same. I hate to say that, don't tell anyone I said that, but you're on YouTube TV and all the squares are the same size. So ABC Square and the War Room Square are the exact same size, and you would not necessarily know. The pictures are prettier too. They're like brightly colored, but go ahead.
Yeah, it's a really important question. I mean, I know for my kids, my daughters, as much as I try to keep them off social media, they're coming to me every day with different headlines from TikTok, because one of them is allowed to use that, and other from YouTube and others. So we can try and limit the sources. At the end of the day, we're all going to have to be more savvy. I think we have to accept the point that it is positive and it is negative. We are going to have to accept this dichotomy of AI. And so when we ask from what source and ask from who it came, I think right now, until there's watermarking and clear standards and transparency and testing, it's asking the questions. It's the more you're talking to your kids and your constituents and saying, hey, this is a great technology. In Taiwan, they're using it to help their kids become more AI literate. They have a chatbot with GPT to help practice English. Well, that's fantastic. Let's think about those use cases, but let's also make sure that use is not biased, because is it teaching racism, sexism, and other isms? So it's both. It is expanding our world and our horizons. It is making healthcare more effective. Harvard Public School of Health had a study that said that our AI diagnosis is likely to bring down costs 50% and improve health outcomes 40%. This is exciting stuff. But we need to all be just asking the questions. That's all we can be doing right now. We have to be taking responsibility to teach people to be asking the questions and trust and verify. Don't trust and verify.
Go ahead.
Hi, Andrea McClellan, Norfolk, Virginia City Council, and it's a great point that deals with my question, which is I'm excited about this. I'm excited about how we can use this in our 911 center, because we don't have enough 911 call operators. I'm excited how we can use this to determine, within our infrastructure budget, how can we best deploy these resources. And so my question is there a clearinghouse for how this is being used in local and state government? Because I want to start putting this to work in our city. The Virginia Employment Commission has been in the headlines for the last couple of years because they have just botched all these unemployment claims. How could AI have been utilized to go through those claims more effectively, more quickly, and for less money? So I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
So it's a great question. Just in the past 6 months, so So we are a science and tech funder. And so we certainly, through the nonprofits and other folks, have just been seeing a range of use cases. And we were like, oh, are you all talking to each other? And like basically no one was talking to each other. So we've done the most basic things, which is like, for example, we created like a Google group just around AI for access. Who are all the nonprofits or anybody else we were working with that is just working on trying to use these technologies to increase access, whether it's access to a benefit or anything else. And most of the like updates that happen in that group, people are like, I didn't know you were doing that. How's it working and everything else? So whether it's joining something like that or the New Deal folks sort of creating something that is like a shared platform, since things are moving quickly, something that allows people to sort of catch, like we just, OpenAI just did this like new GPTs announcement a couple of days ago. So I just asked somebody on my team, hey, can you just track which GPTs are popping up that are trying to use public services? And like already like our running list, it's like a public list, has like 24 examples. Like, oh, here's how you can like figure out your immigration status. Oh, like that's like in 7 days. That announcement was like mid last week. So things are moving quickly, so I do think something that allows people to sort of, hey, is anybody else doing this? Can I learn from them? Would be pretty useful.
Can I double down on that? I just want to talk about, you can't underestimate the value of the community right now in any respect of our life, but with AI use in particular. At Equal AI, we created a badge program because senior executives are saying, what do I do? Where's the liability? How do I address? We're building AI at scale. We need to make sure we have safeguards. What are they? So we created a program with leaders in responsible AI to help answer this question together. What we found they value as much as the content is the community, is being able to ask one another, have you run into this? How are you handling it? So we started another one on the Hill for Hill staff. As much as they love the content, it's being able to talk to one another in a safe space that is almost invaluable and getting so much more praise and so much more needed than we even realized.
We have a question over here.
Yeah, right over here, Ryan Coonerty. Hi.
Sorry, the lights.
No, it's all good. It follows up on Andrea's question, which is sometimes regulations are there to protect us, sometimes they're to protect incumbent industries. And so what are you seeing across states and localities, both internally, you can imagine planning, permitting, plan checking, AI could do like 95% of it, but that's millions less in fees to cities and counties and a lot of jobs potentially lost, or like industries like trust, wills, and estates lawyers who are going to try to prevent AI from being deployed to protect their industry.
Yeah, where do you go for that? Just to your point, if right now you want to go someplace to get some help, say trust, whatever, I was on the Acela, and there was a lawyer behind me that told the whole story of AI, and I don't know who they were talking to. I'm like taking notes. This is how you handle your will. This is how you handle your trust. But if you're not on the Acela, how do you do it? Where do you go, guys?
So just on that, the final part of that. So one of the nonprofits we support is a nonprofit called Upsolve. It specifically focuses on basically allowing somebody's low income to be able to file for bankruptcy without incurring the $2,000 that it costs usually for you to file for bankruptcy. It's an amazing system we have where you have to spend money to file for bankruptcy. So they basically allow you to do that without paying $1. They are worried that they're going to get sued about the fact that they are providing legal services without a legal license. So they actually did filed in New York courts for a summary judgment of like, are we breaking the law? Because they were like, look, we're doing this thing. They've already helped like more than $300 million of debt relief. But they're like, look, at some point people will be like, hey, you're getting too good at providing services to the poor. Maybe you should stop. Right?
Wow.
So I do think that these sort of edge cases are going to come up more, right? Because what they're doing is they're using volunteers, trained volunteers. But trained volunteers plus AI would actually allow them to serve even more. And then somebody might say, well, that technology is like, that's not a, that's our professional trade. That's, so I do think that on one end is going to be a thing. There's a huge amount of concern around regulatory capture as it relates to like the big companies and whether they will be able to operate in a world in which you have to do 75 meetings with NIST today, because it's like, hey, I'm a startup, I don't have a DC office, how am I going to keep up? I haven't seen that much of like big incumbent industries yet, food, telecom, others, showing up and saying, well, it's fine, but like here's the carve we would love. But I do think it's actually very important to check for that, especially as the way DC operates, because often people will say, this is all fine, but make sure we're not part of it.
Okay, one more question.
Hi, Carrie Douglas. I'm a school board member in Oregon, and Ethan and I also run a network for elected school board members around the country. And what we're seeing initially is school board policy being really focused on safety and being risk adverse and fear-based. And just building on Janelle's beautiful story, like especially thinking about our typically under-resourced communities, how do we create policy that helps ensure that students actually get to take advantage of the economic opportunity of AI and are in environments where they get to innovate and explore, because people are so fearful about their children and want to just lock it down, and we're worried about that, continuing the disparities.
I think you need to give people access to it. So a mistake that New York City schools made immediately was to ban ChatGPT in schools, in the labs, on Wi-Fi, which just meant that students that don't have a laptop at home or don't have internet at home couldn't use ChatGPT. It didn't mean that students couldn't. It just meant those that are actually relying on the public for it. And luckily, I've reversed that decision. If AI is going to be part of the job market that they're going into, we need to be training students in what these tools are and letting them experiment and let them develop the new ones. So I'd say anytime you have that, oh, let's crack down, know that that's going to hurt the worse off students more.
And if I could just, again, double down, I think that's the most important question that anyone in the country can be asking right now. Frankly, I think as we're talking about the risks of AI, we need to be mindful, but we also need to take advantage of the opportunities, or the world will leave us behind. If we want to maintain our democracy, we need to maintain our economy, we need to be supporting our AI use, we need to make sure that kids are digitally literate, we need to make sure that they're able to be consumers in an AI economy, we need to make sure that they are able to be the workforce in an AI economy. For my own daughters, our policy at home until the school also banned ChatGPT use, I said, you're allowed to use it, but you have to be transparent about when you've used it and how. I also, if they get a really complicated question, last year we went through and I would show them on ChatGPT a very thoughtful, well-articulated answer. I made them regenerate so they could see there were a few good answers. There's not one right answer, and made them point out what was wrong in the answer. I didn't let them copy it, and they had to be transparent with me and their teacher. So I think before we can jump in, we have to have a few safeguards in place. What is and is not expected. I would hope it's transparency and accountability standards, but then we have to jump in and use it.
Okay, now I want everyone to stand up. Come on, stand up. We're going to stand up on the stage. Get your phone out, okay? Because today is the first day of your AI community. Get your phone up, take a picture. These are your new besties on your AI. Come on, where are your phones? Are you going to take a picture of us? I want you to bring your phone up. All right, take a picture. Here, let's all stand together. Everyone look good. Okay. This is your community. We're all about AI. We're in this together. Okay, on the count of 3. 1, 2, 3, AI. Okay, now I want you to turn around and put yourself in the photo so that you can tell everyone, here's your new AI network. All right, turn around, get a picture of us. We're all in this together. Come on now. Come on. On the count of 3, AI. Okay, you ready? 1, 2, 3, AI. Thank you very much, everyone. These guys are great. Thank you so much. So terrific.
Right. Thank you, Tammy. Such a fantastic panel. Thanks to Miriam, to Assemblymember Boris, and Kumar for terrific discussion. We're going to take a moment and just get our next panel up on stage. We ask folks just to get back in their seats, and we're going to move on here in just a second. Okay. Thank you so much. Obviously, a lot to talk about with artificial intelligence. We'll be continuing that conversation during our breakout sessions. Stay tuned for a lot more from New Deal on AI. But next up, we've got a panel that is a direct result of discussions that came out from our Ideas Summit in Detroit earlier this year, where we heard from New Deal leaders, we heard from partners that you wanted to dig deeper into affordable housing. So that's going to be our next discussion. I want to welcome up our next panel with Dave Williams is going to moderate. He serves on the board of directors at Up for Growth, a national cross-sector member network committed to solving the housing shortage, vice president of Lafayette Square, a nationwide impact investment platform. So we ask just everybody if you could please take your seats or take your conversation out into the hallway, and we're going to bring up our next panel.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Okay, one more time. Good morning. Good morning. Do we have to do selfies again? Are we going to do selfies? Okay, we'll just think we're okay. Thank you for having us. My name is David Williams. Again, I'm at Lafayette Square. We're a national investment firm focused on providing capital in underserved and overlooked communities. And I'm joined by Zach Conine, who is the treasurer of the state of Nevada, and Lily Goldsmith, who is the VP of Social Impact Investing at JPB here in DC. And we're talking about affordable housing. So I think kind of my goal for today is to hit on a few issues. Very exciting that this issue came up in Detroit. I worked in the Detroit mayor's office. I'm from Detroit, so kind of glad to hear that good ideas and collaboration is coming out of my hometown. But the goal for today is to kind of talk about what is the problem, what are ways that we can incentivize more affordable housing, right? How are investment decisions made, and to really kind of have a dialogue about innovative things happening in the field, and what are your concerns as policymakers from across the country. So I'll kind of kick things off with a few kind of comments and framing ideas from my experience and expertise, and then I'll have Zach and Lily introduce themselves, talk about their work and kind of how it applies to this issue in general. So kind of my background, I'm an affordable housing attorney by trade, so it's helping developers build affordable housing using tax credits and other mechanisms. I moved back to my hometown of Detroit to help kind of use that tool set to kind of help rebuild our city. I worked for the mayor, Mayor Duggan, our economic development team, oversaw our commercial real estate portfolio, and was really focused on neighborhood revitalization issues, kind of really helping rebuild the physical infrastructure of the city, because it was right when we were entering into and then thankfully exiting out of bankruptcy. So kind of a Wild West time, but one where there was a lot of space to think creatively around a lot of these issues. I took some of those local experiences nationally and helped build out the public policy arm of a think tank called Opportunity Insights based at Harvard, where we're using big data to study issues of economic opportunity and mobility. And from there worked on some both public sector and private models focused on helping lower income families access opportunity through the housing market. As mentioned, I'm on the board of Up for Growth, and I think we kind of serve as what I think of as the leading pro-housing organization in the country. When we think about affordable housing, I think it's important to take a step back and understand that at the root of it, right, there's a housing supply issue. Right, there are, and it's a really great report, the Housing Underproduction Report, available at upforgrowth.org. There are 4 million fewer units of housing than we need across this country. Right, so they're kind of, given how many people live in this country, to actually house everyone sufficiently, we would need to build 4 million more units, and that underproduction has been getting worse over the past 10 years. 83% of markets across the country have this worse underproduction number happening. And it's kind of spreading from kind of the traditional urban markets that you kind of expect to have these underproduction numbers, moving into the suburbs and to rural areas. So it's really an issue impacting everyone across the country. I think it's really important to understand that that supply issue is really underlying, I think, the affordability crisis that we're facing as a nation. As we think about when I sit in my investor seat, I think important to understand is that, right, building new housing is a very capital-intensive practice. And when we're trying to build new housing or invest in housing, we're typically raising money from third-party investors, right? Pension funds, insurance companies, right? Groups who are looking to figure out how to secure their capital and invest in ways to grow their portfolios. And when we're trying to build new housing and raise money for that housing, right, we're raising money from folks who are looking at other opportunities. So we have to make sure that we can provide the actual returns that are competitive with other investment sources. So I think that's oftentimes a constraint, is that we have to be able to build in ways that can kind of provide returns for developers, but also provide attractive and competitive returns for investors. And if we're trying to build affordable housing and subsidized housing, we usually have to find sources of subsidy that can kind of replace those returns for investors. Working in Detroit, something that we focused on was we had a very weak market, 50 years of decline of the city, a market where it didn't make sense for market rate developers to come into the city and develop. So what we did was we had to create a citywide strategy, kind of leveraging sources like the low-income housing tax credit, new market tax credits, other sources coming from the federal government and state government, and really focusing on target neighborhoods where we could provide certainty to developers that if they were building, if they were creating new housing, there would be support for them, kind of helping de-risk their investments and their activities in our city, kind of bringing a really holistic approach to that kind of work. And then lastly, one example, a group I work with called High Opportunity Neighborhood Partners, thinking beyond just developing new housing, but how do you create new affordable housing using current government programs and subsidies. Our model was buying single-family homes in suburbs that had good schools, low crime, places where a lot of the research from my think tank focused on how these places can really kind of create long-term benefits for kids and families, and then renting those homes exclusively to families who are using Section 8 vouchers, right? Families who oftentimes have a very difficult time using this really great resource and not being able to find housing because of discrimination in the market or other issues. And so that was enabled by a policy called Small Area Fair Market Rent, a HUD program that basically determines that certain regions have to provide their subsidies in ways that they can actually afford the rental rates in higher cost areas. So basically an effort to deconcentrate poverty and help families that use Section 8 vouchers to move to some of these higher opportunity places. And this model was focused specifically on, proactively buying these homes so that these families didn't have to jump through hoops and find private landlords who didn't want to rent to Section 8 families, but was actually kind of encouraging them to move into these homes, into these areas of opportunity. So again, kind of thinking about supply as an underarching or overarching issue when it comes to affordability, and thinking through the innovative models that we can apply both from the public side and the private side to create more affordable housing within our communities. So Zach, would love to kind of hear about your background, what you're up to now, and kind of how that applies to this space.
Sure. Hello, everybody. I'm Zach Conine. I have the pleasure of being the 23rd treasurer of the great state of Nevada. And you might be wondering why a treasurer would care this much about housing. And because we've found that housing is fundamental to every other problem we're trying to solve. That other problems end up being symptoms of a poor housing situation. Early childhood education. If a student is housing insecure, how are they going to focus on paying attention in class? Food insecurity. If a family is housing insecure and moving from place to place, getting access to those resources gets harder and harder. Economic development. Who's going to go start a business if they're not sure where they're going to sleep at night, right? We believe in Nevada that housing, access to affordable housing is a human right. And so we start from that place. And supply is the problem. There is not enough housing. That $4 million number for the number of units that are missing, right? At the average cost of building a door, and I mean the cheapest door, that's $1 trillion problem, right? When you start getting into the cost of development in some of our major urban cores, it gets much, much more expensive. When you start getting into the cost of development in more rural parts of the country where the issue isn't necessarily building the house, it's that the house will be so far away from services that it is not affordable, even if the house is affordable, because you need a car to live there, because you got to pay for Starlink to get access to the internet, because your school, if it exists, is an hour away. Housing is fundamental to the work that all of you are trying to do, whatever that work is. And so our focus in Nevada has been that. Our focus has been on how do we increase supply both from private dollars, from public dollars, from trying to be as clever as possible. Because, and this is, I think, a bit of a downside for everybody in this room, you are all competing for the same money to build housing. You are all competing for the same private dollars, for the same pension dollars, for those insurance dollars that you spoke of. All of those dollars are looking for the best deal, and sometimes the best deal is the highest return, and sometimes the best deal is the less bullshit, right? And so, especially from a local government perspective, you've got to figure out how are we removing friction in this process, because there are other communities that are removing friction in this process. And if you do not remove the friction, the money will move, because it's relatively fungible. I think the other thing that we spend just a ton of time thinking about, right, is how to make sure that while we're building housing, we don't allow ourselves to miss kind of the forest for the trees, right? And this is a zoning question, and I'm not in local government, I'm in finance, so I get to just talk about zoning in a real conceptual, wouldn't it be nice sense, but we probably shouldn't have a lot of it, right? In case study after case study after case study, when we have removed single-family zoning from areas, where we have removed, in some cases, all zoning from areas, right? We have increased housing supply or decreased the inflationary rate. Auckland, right, which I'm sure everybody looks at from a housing perspective all the time, but Auckland removed all zoning in 2016. While every local market around them went up by about 25% in the cost of housing since then, they haven't moved at all. Minneapolis has done great work in this space. And so looking for ways, you know, sometimes you hear, and you will always get this in the public comment, right? We got to preserve the character of the neighborhood, right? We got to preserve the character of the neighborhood. I think people need to sleep inside. And so being able to keep pushing back on that narrative and knowing that not only are you doing it because it's the right thing to do from a morality perspective, but because it's the right thing to do from a capital perspective, because you will be able to attract new capital in, I think is something that's real important. And so from a Treasury perspective, we care about it in Nevada because functionally in Nevada and a lot of other states, housing insecurity is economic insecurity. We don't have a state income tax in Nevada. We have all of you coming in and playing slot machines, which you should do. There's plenty of direct flights from DC, just something to think about. But we don't have a state income tax. And so we need people to consume. We need people to gamble. We need people to buy things. We need people to go to shows, see Taylor Swift, right? We need things like that in order to be effective from a government perspective. And when folks don't have a place to live, they don't do that. And so it's central in our mission. And I'm excited to be here to talk about it. Thanks for having us.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Zach. Willie?
Yeah, good morning. Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here. So I'm Lily Goldstein. It happens a lot, surprisingly, the Smith and the Steen. Oh, no, it's okay. And surprisingly, not the G of JBG Smith, unfortunately. But I'm happy to be here. So JBG Smith, for those of you that don't know, is a Maryland-based REIT. We're traded on the New York Stock Exchange. We have about 15 million square feet of high-quality office, multifamily, and retail in high-growth, high-barrier to entry submarkets in and around the DC metro area. So we're pretty exclusively focused here. And I sit on the impact investing platform that was recently rebranded as Leo Impact Capital. And one of the mechanisms through which we make impact investments is through the impact pool, which is a $115 million third-party capitals, as you mentioned, raised fund that provides financing for the creation and preservation of affordable workforce housing. So we focus primarily on middle income earners, 60 to 120% AMI, area median income in this market. And they're the teachers, nurses, firefighters, those that are really essential to our communities and make our communities run. So through our impact pool, we've preserved a little over 2,800 units to date. We've deployed about 65% of our capital so far. And we focus primarily in the NOAA preservation space. So that's naturally occurring affordable housing. So it's stock that exists today, but is traditionally affordable because of its vintage, because it has sort of lack of amenities, but is well located. And we often look at opportunity insights, and so we focus our investments in high impact neighborhoods. So areas that are amenity rich, retail rich, good schools, low poverty, low crime rate. And want to give children the best possible outcome. And so we are looking at existing Class B and C apartment buildings in those areas to preserve the affordability and actually create committed affordability by putting covenants in place. So we work either with nonprofit organizations where we provide mezzanine financing so that 100% of the ownership is in nonprofit hands, or in jurisdictions or in certain transactions where nonprofit ownership doesn't really necessarily carry a tax benefit, we'll provide equity investments as well. So we have 2 equity deals, and the balance are loans that we provided to affordable housing nonprofits. And a lot of what was mentioned today, I think, is really important in sort of how and why we focus on this area. So about 10 plus or minus years ago, JBG Smith were one of the larger landowners in the area. We have 15 million square feet of existing multifamily office and retail. We have 9.8 million square feet of development pipeline, most of which is multifamily. We own and manage 13,000 apartment units. And so we're a really significant player in this area, but our senior leadership looked around and said, that's great, but who can afford to continue to live here, sort of besides the top of us? And really recognize that it was really an economic driver is housing stability and housing security. And so they started working with other leaders in the area. We partnered with the Federal City Council, which is based here in the district, that focuses on sort of the betterment of the district and focuses on significant policy changes, transportation, water, housing being one of them. Partnered with them and launched this platform about 5 years ago. So we then raised this fund through which we've, as I mentioned, have 2,800 units in just over 3 years because it really speaks to the need and also the availability. So the 4 million units that we need to build in order to be sort of more housing secure across the country, we will always be falling behind if we don't include preservation in the mix. Someone described it as holding a bag of rice and cutting out the bottom and saying, well, we'll just throw more rice in. That's never going to solve the problem. And preservation is not only a key part of the solution, but it is also, to the point you were making about capital, it's an alternative place to spend capital, especially as a private player in the field. We do work with local jurisdictions on tax abatements, on right of first refusal, on pilot programs, payment in lieu of taxes, what have you. We work obviously across multiple jurisdictions here, but we don't require public investment. And we sort of said, where's our expertise? It's in owning, managing, and operating apartment buildings. And so why shouldn't we invest in this space? And there are a lot of incredible sort of capital A affordable housing providers in our region. We're very lucky for that, that are using tax credit programs to redevelop or develop new units. But there really was no private capital going to this workforce space. And we said we can make a return for our investors, albeit at a slightly below market return, although there's sort of what is a market return in an environment like today. But we can really raise private capital. Our primary investors are financial institutions seeking community reinvestment at credit. And sort of let what I call take out some of the lower hanging fruit, take out this stock that is not committed affordability, is at risk of losing these units sort of going out of market, being acquired by value-add investors who will increase the rents. Grab those units. We've proven we can do it, and let the public funding, the more difficult to secure deals, be focused on those that are more deeply affordable and more in need. So we're really excited about sort of how we've been able to accomplish this, and really hope that we're able to sort of get that story out there, because it's not unique to DC. And so other real estate developers, other players in each of your jurisdictions and regions can really enter into this space.
Yeah. No, that's really helpful. And could you speak a little more to, I think, with your investor base and your fund, how you really do balance the kind of the social impact that I think folks are looking for with the returns needed? Because I think that is always a question of, how do you scale initiatives like this, and how could this apply for other communities as well?
Yeah, so so like I mentioned, our primary investment is through mezzanine financing. So subordinate to the first mortgage, we typically work with Fannie or Freddie. Both of the agencies have sort of approved the structure. And so those investments are sort of easier to talk about from a return perspective because it's essentially fixed rate debt. And we target a 7% return to our investors. Many of our investments actually are also tax-free because we place tax-exempt bond financing once we reach our required committed affordability metrics. So yes, it's lower, but it's not 2%. It's still a healthy return. And pension funds, insurance companies are huge sources of capital, but also financial institutions are required to invest. And as we just saw with the new ruling that came out for CRA qualifications, which we're still digging through the 1,600-page piece of legislation, really talks about innovative financing. And there is actually additional credit sort of going outside of the low-income housing tax credit program, the new markets tax credit program, historic preservation, and looking at alternative ways of financing. And so we've been really lucky to work with some of our bank partners to make these investments.
Yeah. No, it's always interesting to see those public-private interplays and kind of what different types of programs, sometimes those more deeply affordable programs that I think are more traditional, but also with your new structures you're innovating and how the public can also play in those as well.
Yeah, and so, and you mentioned money is fungible. And we can sort of talk about this later and sort of how policies across, especially sort of a tri-state, although we call ourselves a tri-state region. Obviously, one of those states is not actually a state, but how different policies affect where you want to invest your money. But broadly speaking, we are very fortunate to be able to work with great public sector partners. We just closed a deal in Montgomery County that reduces our property taxes by 50% for a minimum of 51% of our units at 65% of area median income or below. And so there are a lot of opportunities to sort of work with the local partners to make sure that if they're able to invest and buy down more affordability, we're happy to have the money and we're happy to have additional affordability.
Yeah, 100%.
I think your point about preservation is so important. And you'll have not just the units that you're talking about, right, that are sort of naturally occurring affordable units, but you'll have other units that originally got tax credits to be built as big A affordable, sort of restricted 60% AMI, area median income. Everybody kind of functionally in this room knows how that structure works, right? Seeing some nods. Okay. But to get those low-income tax equity credits, sometimes those properties fall out of affordability because no one's looking at it, right? When we got there a couple of years ago, there wasn't a list at the state of which projects around the state were originally supported by those tax credits. And so some would just age out, right? Because originally, for most projects, if they're old enough, they were 15 years, some were 20 years. And so they were affordable for 20 years, and then they aged out of the program and immediately went to market rate. Right? And so you've lost that affordability stock. And from a cost per door perspective, it is so much more expensive to build new. From a zoning perspective, you don't have a zoning fight. It's already affordable. The neighbors are already comfortable with it being affordable. It's always been affordable. And so making sure that your state or your local government has a good list of those projects and when they're going to fall off is a very easy thing to implement. But it can save you hundreds of doors on a calendar basis that would just effectively age out of the process.
And to that point, also specifically for year 15 low-income housing tax credit expiring deals, to keep them in the tax credit program, you have to recommit a ton of capital. These buildings are 15 years old. They are fine. We're investing in a lot of buildings that were built in the 40s and 50s. This is good quality construction. And so it's, and I hate to speak negatively of the tax credit program because I think it has done incredible work to create and preserve affordable housing across our country. But then you have to put additional dollars in where it's not needed just to keep it in the tax credit program. And so to look at private partners to continue on that affordability is a much better solution and a much more efficient use of the public tax credit dollars.
100%. I think it's such an important point that these things can just fall away. And just by taking stock of these portfolios, kind of understanding when they're expiring, like that first step is actually a very important one that is not happening across the country. I think oftentimes we assume that there must be someone watching out for all this. There oftentimes isn't. So I think that's one, I think, very helpful example of kind of how we can all be proactive on this front. You know, when you opened, you mentioned that, you know, typically you don't see state treasurers on panels about affordable housing. So I was kind of curious, you know, what
Typically, you don't see state treasurers on panels. I think that's
fair enough.
Let's start with the treasurer, just anonymous nature.
Also
we need to find
Also,
that.
we're clearly not the AI panel because we all like have paper here. You actually have the phones, but yeah.
Yeah, no, we're old school. That's okay.
Old school.
But I was curious, so what levers are you able to pull from your perch that kind of really can have an impact in this space, and kind of how can we all think creatively around kind of our positioning and how we can be active in the affordable housing space?
I appreciate that. I think the first thing to look at is the programs that are already available from the federal government that your state or local community might not be taking full advantage of, right? So private activity bonds issued by HUD come into your state. They can be used for a number of things, but one of the things they can be used for is affordable housing tax credits through conduit bond issuances. And we could talk about conduit bond issuances, but I'm losing people already, so we're not going to do that. But the point is there is money in your state that can be used for affordable housing, both creation of new affordable housing or preservation of affordable housing. And a lot of states send that money back, right? And sometimes they send that money back because there isn't a project that sort of meets the Venn diagram of should do it and how the program works. But in a lot of cases, they send it back because they're not actively trying to find developers. And so one of the routes that we've been able to take in the Treasury, but other folks have been able to take, is simply going out and looking for developers who do affordable housing in other states who are not doing affordable housing in your state and asking them why. Are they not doing it because the juice isn't worth the squeeze? Are they not doing it because there's some sort of local zoning issue? Did they have a problem with the clerk at a planning commission 17 years ago? I mean, it's problems like that, right? As we all know, sometimes government is just a little bit goofy. And figuring out ways to remove those frictions is a really easy thing to do. And it doesn't require, you don't need statutory authority. You don't need sort of the joke about treasurers, right, is nobody actually knows what we do. But the good thing about treasurers, if nobody knows what you do, nobody knows what you don't do. And so you can lean into these things and ask questions. And often those questions, you find the friction points are really small. Right? So we've used private activity bond cap a lot. A lot of you had access to or saw a massive amount of money come in from the federal government through ARPA. Some of that's still floating around, right? We were able to use in Nevada, we've received about $2.7 billion in direct funding. I don't know if anyone's ever gotten a wire for $2.7 billion. It's a very strange thing. You get the notice on your phone. You're like, and of course, because it's federal treasury, they sent it to us Friday at 12:15. If anyone's a bond investor, you know what a problem that is. But anyway, we kept it. But that 2.7, we were able to put about $500 million of it into affordable housing. And one of the ways that we were able to do that is we asked housing developers in the state already, housing developers that weren't in the state already, people who are at all kind of levels of affordable housing, because we're talking about affordable sort of big A, typically 60% or less, right? Workforce housing, typically 120% of area median income or less. But there's also things that government is almost always going to need to be involved in, like supportive housing, right? Assisted living housing, housing where the math doesn't work, at least in no model I've ever seen. But the math doesn't work for a private investor, but can work with a little bit of government help. And we were able to take $500 million of that 2.7 and put it towards the creation of new housing, right? Great. The subsidizing of housing that had become less, sort of had moved out of the band of possibility because of inflation. Right, so as lumber costs were going all goofy, right, to try and keep that steady. And then in preservation. And preservation locally, another thing you can think about is age-in-place preservation. So you might have an individual in a home and they can afford that home, but that home is 2 stories and they're getting a little bit older and it's hard for them to go upstairs, right? Or the addition, I mean, it's so simple, but the addition of sturdy ADA accessible rails and ramps into older housing is a great way to keep that housing stable and allow people to age in place. And when people can age in place, it helps with the transition, right? The generational wealth transition, because they don't have to sell the home that they've lived in their whole life in order to pay for an assisted living facility. And if they don't have to sell the home, they're able to give it to their kids. And when they're able to give it to the kids, housing is one of the largest sources of generational wealth in the country. Which is why things like redlining have been so destructive to populations. Being able to keep folks in their houses should be kind of our core mission, right? And any tool we can use to do that, I think, is effective. So to answer your question, like why are we involved, or how did the treasurer get involved? It needed to, right? Necessity is a hell of a thing.
100%, 100%. So I want to open up things for questions.
Hi. Thank you. Your humor about receiving this wire on a Friday is good, but once you had this money, and you're saying you spent about $500 million on these various programs, how did you administer it? Like, did your office keep the funds? Do you have a housing agency? Do you have an economic development agency? Did you work with nonprofits on aging in place programs? Like, how did you disperse that?
It's a great question. I mean, the first thing we did was we rolled around in it, right? It was great. Got it in singles. It filled a room. It was the whole thing. The second thing we did, right?
Government sounds fun.
It's Nevada. It depends on your state, right? So in Nevada, we have a very, very small government. We have the smallest governor's office number of people, not per capita, but just in the country. Right? There are 40-odd people in the Treasury, 60-ish now. There are about 3 people in the Nevada Housing Division, right? But all of you have a housing division, right? First off, there's a housing division in every state. Sometimes it's in economic development. Sometimes it's in business and industry, or whatever your catch-all sort of commerce department is. And so we worked through existing programs. We tried to, the easiest thing to do with ARPA spend, as everybody knows, was to plus up things that were already happening, right? To do more of work that worked. And so we did that, right? The money that went into a program was called Home Means Nevada, which is also our state song. We could sing it later. But the money that went into that program basically just plussed up existing private activity bond cap projects, right? So they were grants that went on top of projects that had already gone through that. So we had already vetted the projects. We had a way to vet the projects. And I think that's important just from a bureaucratic speed perspective, right? The more we can take advantage of existing things and make them a little bit stronger or faster, it's so much easier than setting up new programs. Age in Place, we worked with local nonprofits. The preservation work works just like the new housing work, right? Went through that same program. And then we did a fair amount, I don't know if you've looked at any of these programs, but down payment assistance programs were helpful. And the federal guidelines on down payment assistance, the sort of where your income needs to be and what your credit score needs to be, is a bit of a unicorn individual, what the house price needs to be, right? Especially as house price rising. There's not too much of it. And so we were able to expand it, but we were able to expand it in a targeted way. We were able to focus on teachers, which we have a massive shortage of, like everybody else, and medical professionals and veterans. Right? And so we were able to expand what that Venn diagram center looked like in a way that hopefully was effective.
And if I can add on specifically to the down payment part, it's important to obviously have a job, but also your credit score. Yes. And this is sort of a little bit of a different direction, if you don't mind, but that is, I think, something so important. So housing, obviously, of course, is hugely important generational wealth. But in order to get to the starting line, you have to have a credit score. And many of our renters, particularly middle and lower income renters, don't have a credit score. And so another aspect of our investment program is working through this impact framework. And we partner with Isuzu. I don't know if anyone here is familiar with them, but they do on-time positive rental reporting to the credit agencies. Because until Isuzu, and there are similar programs, came about, your rent check is generally, I sort of hope, is likely your largest check you're paying every month. And it was never reported to a credit agency. And so we have seen across our portfolio a significant increase, and I wish I had the stats off the top of my head, but I don't, but a significant increase in new credit scores established and improved credit scores through, again, on-time rental payments. They also have a short-term loan program so that they can assist in sort of a month-to-month if you get into a car accident, if you have some sort of other emergency bill that prevents you from being able to pay your rent on time that month. They have a short-term loan program with many times with 0% interest to help you get through that blip. So that you can continue to save, you can continue to build a credit score so that you can take advantage of a down payment program and move into a home of your own and start that generational wealth program.
I think such an important point because, to your point, Zach, I think we want everyone housed, right? Housed in ways that they can actually afford and it's not a burden to their kind of income, but also it can really serve as a platform for building wealth and services and other support. And I think, to your point earlier, creating access to places where families will have better outcomes as well. So I think there's that kind of first tier problem, which is getting people housed in ways that's sustainable, but then really housing can be a platform for greater economic mobility as well. I think there's a question here.
The aging in place issue is really important and interesting one. We set aside some resources to help seniors age in place in our community. But I will say I was conflicted about it because the flip side of that is that you have seniors often who are the only one in the house staying in homes longer, meaning that those houses aren't available to younger families that are looking for the starter home. And I'd love your thoughts on whether there's been any place that's figured out a way to address your concern, which is allowing for that generational wealth transfer and also avoiding the acquisition of those properties by institutional investors, which are increasingly turning home ownership properties into rental properties in a community like mine. But at the same time, free those homes up so that the multi-bedroom house can be used for a larger family. And I know this is annoying, but I have one other question, which is the rolling off of affordability. This may be a little bit unique to my city. I'm mayor of Hartford, Connecticut, a very property tax dependent city. All of those affordable deals come with tax credits. And what happens is when they're required to make a massive capital investment to maintain their affordability, they also come asking for another tax abatement. And as a result, you have a poor community that is proud to shoulder the responsibility of providing affordable housing, but pays a steep price and keeps the community poorer. And wondering whether there's anybody out there doing anything interesting on that point.
The second piece is a mess. That's all I got.
So that's really where, so we have a property here in the district that was a year 15 expiring deal, and it was the same thing. It's still in an up and coming neighborhood, and the options were not great. It was likely to go just market rate. And we were able to work with a nonprofit partner, the Washington Housing Conservancy, and with the District of Columbia to provide financing to the Conservancy to acquire the property. And there is an in-place tax abatement for nonprofit ownership in the district. So that certainly helped with the deal, but we also are able, but that's sort of where it starts and stops in terms of public funding. We didn't have to go back out to the tax credit program. We didn't have to infuse a ton of capital into it, and it's now being operated as actually going up to 80% once the tax credit is sort of officially winds down. And right now it's obviously sort of 60% and below. But so it will also actually provide additional opportunity for that neighborhood, for residents there to continue to stay with limited public resources. And so it's looking at other private developers, I think, in your area who know how to operate sort of these, vintage apartments. And yes, there is income verification, which is a whole other topic and is a big burden to sort of get you through the wind down of the tax credit program. We continue to income verify personally, but I know a lot of organizations that are investing in this don't. They just sort of base it on how sort of the rent compares to incomes. But yeah, look at some of the private developers because there is an area of expertise here and you can rely on the private sector. Not to speak for them, but.
And you should speak for them. I think it's fine. On the first question, right? I think the core question is, do we want to displace someone who's currently in a home to make room for someone else in a new home? And I would say functionally no, right? That's a very specific and difficult decision, right? And I wouldn't want to be the mayor of a small town with that problem. Sorry, but the larger question, that kind of the kernel you got to at the end there, right, which was the concept of money coming in from other places, private equity money in a lot of cases, coming in large scale and purchasing homes. In Nevada, we've actually had a problem where developments, single family home developments, were started, paid for, soup to nuts, to be rental properties, right? Owned by large private equity companies as rental properties, like from the get, right? So you're taking inventory that was going to move into the single family home space and is now in the renter space, and the renter space broadly isn't great for creating generational wealth. I'm glad that they're building the inventory to your point, kind of supply over everything, but how do you make sure that people are actually living in these homes? It's tough, right? Because anything you do that restricts the usage of that asset is going to, by definition, move capital other places, right? And so you got a bit of a seesaw approach there. One thing we've seen has some value is putting deed restrictions for single-family usage owned by a person as a first home for some period of time. And so at least you get some time where that home or that apartment is actually controlled by a person who's living there. And then over time, of course, the market takes over. But that is a difficulty, the kind of how do we create solutions that are going to protect people, but at the same time constrict the market, knowing that the market can move capital other places. And there's a lot of conversations about rent control. My argument would be rent control is a symptomatic approach as opposed to a disease approach. It almost always moves capital somewhere else because money's
Can
fungible.
confirm.
Right.
A good time for 1 or 2 more questions.
Yep. Good morning. Marvin Pendarvis, State Representative out of South Carolina. So I've got a comment and then a two-part question. So first, really appreciate a treasurer being on the panel. I've got a good relationship with the treasurer of South Carolina, and he and I have actually worked together. We recently passed a state low-income housing tax credit similar to the federal version. And so it's had some impact, but there are unintended consequences, like the mayor pointed out, where you've got a proliferation of private investment that's come in, but also has led to the displacement in some communities. And so my question is, you talked about a lot of the federal programs that exist that municipalities and states could potentially take part of and take advantage of. Can you elaborate on that? And then secondly, has there been any conversation about reconfiguring the AMI? We know the impact that has on affordable housing, and obviously that's largely, that's federally, but that's a big factor into how we develop. And so has there been any conversation about reconfiguring that?
On the first one, I could take a second.
So you actually probably can speak to the first one a little bit better. But I can say on the AMI, actually, it's funny, I was going to take the second part. On the AMI, it's sort of interesting because we sort of work outside of the federally funded programs. That's a big sort of thought part of a big part of our thought process here. We want to see success for our residents. And in a lot of the federally funded programs, notably the low-income housing tax credit program, where you're really capped at a 60% AMI average. Well, what happens if you get a huge promotion? Should you have to leave the home that you've built? And so all of our communities are mixed income for that purpose. We're no more than 75%, depending on if we use any public dollars, we're no more than 75% affordability restricted. And that's so that there's that cliff isn't there, and residents can continue to build wealth, continue to advance in their careers, and stay in their home if they choose to, without saying, congratulations on that $50,000 promotion, but you got to go. And so I don't know if you want to talk about the federal funded.
Sure, because the affordability is based on a percent of units at the property as opposed to a specific unit being restricted.
Yes, that too. Yeah, that's a good clarification. Yeah, so it's broadly, we just, at move out, we sort of look at where our current unit mix is and then decide if that can be available to an affordable renter or if it can be a market rate renter.
So the private activity bonds through low-income tax credits, that is the biggest tool that's out there. HUD is spending a lot of time looking at the way they provide vouchers. Historically, vouchers, at least in the recent history, have been person-based, right? So you have a voucher and then you go try to find housing. It can be easier from a financing perspective if the vouchers are location-based, right? So you have a project, and in that project, some of the units are voucher units. So if someone is eligible for a voucher, they can use one of those units as opposed to trying to find, right? Which is a great way to make sure that the vouchers that are coming into your state actually go to where they're supposed to go, right? In Nevada, we've got a waiting list. It's about 2 years for individuals, bless you, who have access to those vouchers but can't actually spend them, right? And so figuring out ways that you can connect individuals with those resources, with places they can use, I think is a big opportunity on the ground. And then the last thing I'll mention is we created in the state a program to take advantage of pension capital called an infrastructure bank. So we created a state infrastructure bank. And within the regulations of that infrastructure bank, we created 2 things. One, the ability for us to partner with private capital from outside the state. Depending on what state you're in, you might have restrictions against the state being involved in equity deals. And so figuring out a way around that can matter. But we also did it, and we really targeted a type of capital, which was union pension capital, Taft-Hartley capital, that is specifically restricted towards deals that A, pay prevailing wage, B, are built under project labor agreements. And so by doing that, we've created sort of a virtuous cycle wherein we've partnered with a group, and I don't know if anyone ever heard of the AFL-CIO's Housing Investment Trust? Okay, you should, because they're doing some amazing work in the housing space. They're one of the largest developers and funders of affordable housing in the country. It is all built union. Some of it is affordable, big A, under 60%. Some of it's workforce, some of it's market rate. But they're building this housing in states. And one of the ways states can partner is we can take a little bit of our money, go into that subordinate position, right? Make the deal work for them. Their money is coming from union pensions, and then union folks are building these properties, putting money into their pension, and so it creates a bit of a virtuous cycle. So their return rate is actually effectively shrunk because they are kind of getting the benefit across the board. State of Nevada is going to spend about $20 million of our money on this, and it's being paired with a $200 million investment from the AFL-CIO's Housing Investment Trust, and they will do 100 of these deals. So I encourage you, we can make introductions, but that's a good tool. That isn't necessarily a federal tool, but we know that when HUD is looking at projects and those projects are creating good middle-class jobs, they're easier to get funded.
And if I can just add on the voucher point, I think that's really important, especially sort of from a private developer. So in the District of Columbia, you cannot discriminate against source of income. So we have to take vouchers. We love that because we know where the income is coming from. So I think personally, it's just good business to allow voucher holders to actually find a home. It's one thing to have a voucher, it's another to find an apartment unit. But also from the partnership with the jurisdiction, we are lucky that it's sort of a relatively smooth process with the district, but that's not true everywhere. And so making sure, making sure that the voucher payments are sort of seamless, coming on time to the property owner is a big way to encourage acceptance of vouchers in jurisdictions where it's not required, and can really make a huge impact. And just sort of cleaning that up would be helpful.
And even in jurisdictions where it's required, it will encourage the creation of more housing that wants those vouchers, that is going after those vouchers. See, and you're just trying to remove friction points here.
Yeah.
I think it's that overall theme of collaboration between private and public, finding those friction points, figuring out the ways we can work together more effectively.
Absolutely.
Awesome. I think that is one more. All right.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I wish our state kept all their money and rolled around in it. Instead, they sent it back. I'm the mayor of Boise in Idaho. So a couple things. I mean, I actually am trying to figure out how we work with AFL within the constraints of state law, because we want to do more of that. And there are formula issues when it comes to LIHTC opportunities for developers in Idaho because the formulas were built so long ago, and it's not reflective of who we are today. I had a question, though, on NOAA preservation and the work you're doing. You know, we are on target. We set goals. We're on target to meet, like, the city-engaged affordable housing with both big A and little a. We did some gap financing. The state kept $50 million that they put into gap financing for housing, so that was nice. We got one project out of that. But we're struggling to meet, like, we're going to meet it, but we're behind on meeting our preservation of existing affordable housing goals. So I was wondering, you know, I can find out more offline, like who in different regions is doing this work, because I'd love to talk. But do you is your own company managing the apartment complexes that you get, or do you find, as you say, local nonprofits, are they also the managers of this? And then are you doing more than apartment complexes? Are you purchasing mobile home parks or other things like that and looking at keeping them in trust, or just curious about the different tools that you're using?
So a few things. So first, we do primarily look at apartment complexes. Just sort of that's really what's available here in the close-in DC region. So I mentioned quickly that our primary investor are financial institutions seeking CRA credit. So we are restricted to the DC MSA. And so our primary nonprofit partner, the Washington Housing Conservancy, is sort of under this umbrella known as the Washington Housing Initiative, through which our impact pool was originally created, and so they're our primary partner. As part of standing them up, we JBG Smith provide all of the real estate services, so we do property manage, although we're looking at are we the best fit for that. But there are a ton of national providers in that space that do third-party manage on behalf of other affordable housing providers. And so but we work very closely with them. We do asset manage all of our properties. And I think, so it's interesting that you said you got one deal out of the 50 million that you all kept.
The state kept 50 and they put one deal in Worcester.
Oh, okay. Because I was going to say, so one of our investments that we made in Maryland, we received like a $2 million soft loan, and that got the state the county a couple hundred units of committed affordability. And so it's really leveraging the private dollars. We provided, I think it was like 20 some odd % of the capital stack for that particular deal. The agency financing provided 70%. So you're really leveraging the private capital that's out there for not only the nonprofits, but then also for public dollars as well. And I might have forgotten another question. Oh, who's doing this in other jurisdictions? Not enough people, quite honestly, and that's sort of why we're out here as often as we can talking about it. So I'd love to chat, and if you know of any sort of high quality developers in your jurisdiction, in your city, that you think would be great for this, we're happy to talk to them. Again, we're sort of focused right now on the DC Metro. We are looking at going up and down sort of the southeastern seaboard and expanding our platform, which was part of our rebrand away from just Washington. But we hope that other jurisdictions copy this because we think it's been so successful here, and it's definitely replicable in other areas.
Well, I want to thank Zach and Lily for their time and thank everyone for the great questions.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
All right, good morning, everyone. Happy Friday. We have one more group of breakout sessions before our closing lunch. For those of you going to the broadband and public safety breakout sessions, those are going to be upstairs on the second floor in the same rooms as yesterday. For those of you attending the artificial intelligence breakout session, note that this is a change from your agenda. The artificial intelligence session will be in the Glover Park room, which for those of you who joined us on Wednesday night for the opening reception is right through this door over here to your right. We will start the breakout sessions in about 5 minutes and wrap up at 12:15. When we wrap up at 12:15, please grab a boxed lunch from the Foxhall room and come back in quickly so that we can begin the final program. Thank you.